Hello 3D2, this is your review of ceramics. So our unit objectives is to refamiliarize students about clay and processes in ceramics, review the stages of clay, revisit the rules, principles, and processes of working with clay, and to form an understanding of the various ways to finish a ceramic artwork. Yes, these are goals. So ceramics, is it art or design? You can make functional and non-functional objects from clay. And most of us have experienced these domestic objects made of clay, such as a toilet, a bowl, a mug. And these are things that everyone can respond to. So every project you create has a design, right? You made these decisions when you were planning, creating, and finishing the project. So what makes ceramics an art? Well, it evokes emotion, it can spark questions, and when we look at an artwork, we often have different interpretations. This means there's many meanings based on the viewer's experiences. It's created for the artist, maybe they're experimenting a technique. It's not always planned out first. That means they try something out to see what happens. And what they create is not always going to be useful. So what makes ceramics a form of design? Well, it must be understood, right? When we look at something, we need to know, what is it? It aims to solve a problem. So think of a chair. What problem does a chair solve, right? It's a place for us to sit. It has a clear message, like it's very obvious of what it is meant to do. It engages the viewer to do something, right? Think of kitchen utensils, right? It's engaging us to actually work with those kitchen utensils when we're cooking. It's often planned out before making because, again, the design means there's a lot of decisions that have been made in the beginning. How big is it? What color? What material is being used? What is it going to look like before it's actually manufactured? Usually there's an audience. That means there's an intended user or someone who needs to use that particular form. The work has a clear purpose, right? When we see something that's a design, we understand what it's intended to do. Sometimes art and design can combine. So when art and design are combined, we get the creativity of art, but we're also using the process and direction of design. So art and design, yes, they sometimes are like two different camps of thinking, but they're actually related most of the time. And sometimes designers are artists, and sometimes artists are designers. It's not just one field that somebody is in. So what makes the material clay? Well, clay, we call this material made of decomposed rock combined with water to create a plastic, malleable body. So clay is natural. It's made of materials that we find in nature. It's found in the ground. It can be dug up, used immediately, mixed, altered, dried, stored, re-wetted, and then fired. Clay has been used for thousands of years. There's an example of gathering clay. So what is clay made of, and how does this affect it as a material? Well, the first material that is used in clay is silica. This is like sand. When it's heated, it becomes glass. This is that prime material you don't want to breathe in, right? We don't want to breathe in clay dust. Why? It contains silica that can hurt our lungs over a long period of time. Clay also includes alumina. This strengthens the clay. And it also includes water. This makes the clay moldable and malleable. You might remember that our clay sometimes includes grog. Grog is actually fired bits of clay that's added, and that makes the clay stronger. So this is a very basic list of materials that create clay, but there's obviously some other components involved. Now, everything that you do with the clay is affected by three variables. That they are moisture, plasticity, and heat. So moisture is very important with clay because it determines what we can do with it. When there's a lot of water in clay, it's slip, but when there is just a little bit of water in clay, it's plastic or leather hard. When we let all the water evaporate, all the moisture's gone, that becomes bone dry, and then when we fire it in the kiln for the first time, that also removes any lasting moisture. Plasticity is also important with the clay because that determines what we can do with the clay. Can we wedge it? Can we roll it into a slab? Can we form it into a coil? Can we smush it on another form? And then heat is also important because heat helps the clay become permanent, right? When we fire the clay in the kiln, it heats up to 1900 degrees, so it is a very important factor. So do you remember these general principles of ceramics? Clay that has plasticity means when fired inside the kiln, the clay becomes, as clay dries, let's review. Clay that has plasticity means it's able to be shaped by hand. It's malleable. When fired inside the kiln, the clay becomes permanent. You can't go back and change the forms. As clay dries, it shrinks. Why does it shrink? Because the moisture is evaporating, the water is leaving the clay. You may not see much of a shrinkage, but it does shrink a little bit. This is why sometimes glaze can crack, because it shrinks a little bit more during the glaze fire. So let's review the stages of clay. Match the labels with the numbers in your notes. We're going to start with slip, number 1. Now, I will not give you slip. I will give you clay. That's at stage number 2. But if you take clay and add a lot of water, you create slip. We use this to attach pieces of clay together. It's a necessary thing that we need. Now, when you let that slip dry out a little bit, it becomes plastic. Again, this is where plastic comes from the word plasticity. You will know your clay is plastic because it's easy to wedge, you can form it, you can make coils, it's not going to crack so easily. This is clay from the bag, or it's recycled clay. This is the stage of clay that I give you. I like to call this fresh clay. It's easy to work with. Now when we let that plastic clay dry out a little bit more, it becomes leather hard. Now leather hard, we sometimes need it to be leather hard. It's clay that's been outside of the bag for 1 to 2 hours. This is a great stage for carving, like you can see right here, right? We can carve into the clay without poking a hole in it. It's not gonna, the form isn't gonna mess around too much. And we can still score and slip our clay when it's at the leather hard stage because it still has some moisture. Now, if we take that leather hard clay and let it dry out completely, it becomes bone dry. So bone dry is the most fragile state. This is when you can easily break your clay project. All the water, well, most of the water has evaporated because again, when we fire it in the kiln, it's going to take out some more water. It might feel dry or cold to the touch. And the thing is, when it's bone dry, we cannot attach pieces to the surface. Like, it's broken. It's very hard to try to attach everything back together. But you can recycle the clay at this stage. So that's why we're pausing here. You can recycle the clay at this stage because we haven't fired it in the kiln. We can take this bone dry clay and actually turn it into slip. Now, we're done with our artwork. It's bone dry. So we're ready to put it in the kiln. This is where we're going to put it through a bisque fire. So what happens during that bisque fire? The clay is heated up to 1900 degrees. The clay shrinks a little bit. It's a 24-hour process. The particles fuse together as the water evaporates from the clay. So like this whole chemical change happens. And if it's heated too quickly, the water can turn to steam and that can cause the clay to explode. So that's why it's really important that Miss J makes sure that the kiln is working properly. So once we take it out of the kiln from that first firing, we now have bisque ware. Now this is very porous clay. It has little holes, right? Think of a sponge. It has lots of little holes, but it's ready for glaze or paint. It also is a bit fragile depending on how thick those walls are. Now we can take that clay, if we glaze it, we're going to put the artwork back in the kiln. We have to fire it again because we need that glaze to go through a chemical change. The glaze literally melts on the surface. Now, if we take Bisqueware and paint it, what happens? So we put the artwork in the kiln because we're going to run a glaze fire. And when it's done, we take it out of the kiln and it's all nice and colorful. That is now glazeware. So the glaze has essentially turned into a glass. If that glaze is food safe, you can eat and drink out of it, but it is not microwave or dishwasher safe. And essentially your project is done. Test yourself. Do you remember this from 3D Design 1? At what stages can your clay be recycled? Those are plastic, leather hard, and bone dry, because once the clay has been bisque fired, it goes through a chemical change and we cannot recycle it. What is changing during each stage of clay? The water content is evaporating, right? The moisture is leaving the clay. What is the purpose of wedging? Well, we wedge to improve the workability of clay by mixing and eliminating air bubbles. We do need to mix the clay every time we have it recycled. We got to mix it up. And if we don't mix it up, then your project can explode just like this. Where and how will you recycle your clay? So you're going to take clay scraps, you're going to add water in a bag and leave it in an enclosed space to wedge later, just like you can see there. Let's go over the golden rules of ceramics. Do you remember these? Why should we thoroughly cover our clay projects when we're not working on them? Well, if we don't cover our clay projects, the clay will dry out. So we got to cover it in plastic wrap, or a plastic bag. How do we minimize clay dust? Because you know the clay dust is not good to breathe in. Clay dust is harmful if you're breathing in for long periods of time. So we use a sponge and water when we clean up. Why? Because clay contains microscopic particles, specifically what's inside that silica. It can irritate and damage your lungs. Why should clay pieces never be thicker than your thumb? Clay that's thicker than your thumb can contain air pockets and moisture, and it will take longer to dry out prior to firing. It also can crack. So when I see projects that have really, really thick walls or just things that are thick, I'm always a little hesitant to fire it. If you're unsure, err on the side of caution and just hollow it out. What is the purpose of scoring and slipping? We score and slip clay pieces together when the clay is wet or leather hard, so the pieces will not fall apart. We need the levels of moisture to be the same, because if we don't score and slip, they fall apart. They won't stick together. Other than to remove air pockets, why else should we wedge our clay? And I might have already talked about this. So if the clay has air pockets and it's fired, that air needs to escape and your piece can crack and blow up. Wedging removes those air pockets and helps achieve consistency. So why do sculptural forms need to be hollow? Like you don't want to have that situation where that head blew up. When you have solid clay, you're at risk of having air pockets and moisture. So we just need to hollow out forms, and when they're hollow out, we need to put needle holes in the bottoms of those projects. Why can bone dry clay be recycled? Bone dry clay can be recycled because it has not been fired yet. This is not really a question, but remember, handle your project with care and gently with 2 hands. Be aware of who's around you. If you drop your clay, it could get smushed or it breaks and then you're sad. Please don't touch another person's work. If something's in the way, ask them if they can move it. And number 10, why can clay pieces explode during firing? Hint, can. They might not explode, but they can. So there's 2 reasons. The first one is moisture, because that means the clay should be dry. The second reason is trapped air. So if there's any trapped air, it's going to explode because that air heats up, it needs to escape. So how do we avoid those explosions? Well, we avoid having overly thick areas in our projects, and we just want to make sure that the clay is completely dry before firing. Now you're going to actually get into a little review about the hand building techniques, but I'm just going to gloss over them really quickly. We have pinch, we have coil, we have slump and drape mold, we have slab, and there we are.